A young groom was tragically killed shortly after marrying a 75-year-old woman with strong opinions about her wedding. In this story, we explore the unique dynamics of their relationship, the conflicts that emerged, and the shocking events that left both a family and a community in shock. Braxton Townsend, at just 18, had recently graduated high school in the small town of Searchlight, Nevada. Braxton had always been adventurous, yearning to break free from his modest background and experience a life of luxury and excitement. Those close to him often described him as easygoing and charismatic. Friends and family remembered his dreams of leaving behind his ordinary life for something much more extraordinary. Braxton's dream took a turn when he met Pat Braun at a lavish charity event in Las Vegas, where he was working as a waiter. Pat, a 75-year-old transgender millionaire, had recently transitioned and was renowned for her flamboyant lifestyle and strong presence. Braxton was immediately drawn to Pat's confidence and the glamorous world she embodied. Their connection blossomed, and Pat eagerly welcomed him into her life, showing him experiences he had only dreamed of. For the first time, he found himself enjoying designer outfits, upscale dining, and lavish parties. With each outing, Braxton became increasingly thrilled about his future, feeling as though he had finally discovered the life he had always envisioned. Not long after they met, Pat proposed, and despite their age difference, Braxton happily accepted. Friends remarked that he viewed Pat as a gateway to a fresh start, dreaming of a future free from financial worries and constraints. The couple's engagement quickly stirred conversation in Seven Hills, their gated community in Henderson, Nevada. Neighbors had mixed reactions. Some questioned Braxton's intentions, while others admired Pat's daring spirit. As their wedding date in February 2019 drew nearer, Braxton became increasingly caught up in the excitement. Braxton dedicated his days to choosing the perfect tuxedo, even sharing his selections with friends on social media. Pat went all out, booking a luxurious venue and organizing a designer cake along with exclusive catering. Yet, as the wedding approached, Braxton appeared increasingly anxious in those final days. Friends observed that Braxton was quieter than usual, but he dismissed their worries. He seemed to be grappling with mixed emotions about the life he was about to embrace and the responsibilities it entailed. In private conversations, he confided in close friends that he questioned whether he was truly ready to marry someone so much older, particularly someone with such a strong personality. Despite his doubts, Braxton felt a deep sense of gratitude toward Pat for introducing him to a lifestyle he had only dreamed of. As the wedding day approached, he attempted to set aside his concerns, eager to embrace the life he believed he wanted. In just a few days, he would be entering a marriage that promised luxury, but he could never have anticipated what lay ahead. It was late February 2019, and Henderson, Nevada, was experiencing an unusually cold morning when the search for 18-year-old Braxton Townsend began. He had been missing for several days, prompting concern among his friends. However, it was Pat Braun's housekeeper, Maria Delgado, who first sensed that something was seriously amiss. As Maria went about her daily tasks in the sprawling mansion, she noticed that Braxton's belongings were undisturbed and that Pat was behaving oddly. On the morning of February 27th, while in the kitchen, Maria caught a strange odor near the sink. Curiosity piqued. She leaned in closer and discovered what appeared to be dark stains in the drain. Initially, Maria thought the stains were merely food residue, but an unsettling feeling lingered. Concerned by Pat's silence regarding Braxton's disappearance, she made the decision to contact the police. Her voice trembled as she relayed her observations to the dispatcher. Maria expressed a mix of fear and unease, sensing that something terrible had occurred. When the police arrived at the gated community of Seven Hills, they took her report seriously. The normally quiet neighborhood was not accustomed to such activity, and soon neighbors began to notice the growing commotion. Investigators arrived in marked patrol cars, drawing the attention of residents familiar with Pat Braun, a well-known figure in the community. Within minutes, the officers entered the kitchen and quickly detected the odor that Maria had mentioned. As they examined the area, they noticed faint, unusual residue leading from the sink, raising further suspicions. As they investigated the drain more closely, the officers began to suspect that they were facing something much darker than a typical missing persons case. Their concerns intensified as forensic experts arrived to collect samples from the drain for testing. What started as a quiet inquiry quickly escalated into one of the most unsettling investigations the community had ever experienced, raising urgent questions about Braxton's fate. When detectives Mark Ellison and Tajana Prude of the Henderson police arrived at the upscale gated community, it was evident that this was no ordinary call. The mansion where 18-year-old Braxton Townsend had been living with 75-year-old Pat Braun was eerily quiet, despite several luxury cars parked in the driveway. The modern architectural marvel, with its high ceilings and expansive glass windows, felt more like a crime scene than a home. Detectives Ellison and Prude, seasoned professionals in the department, were known for their calm approach to challenging cases. On the morning of February 27, 2019, they entered the expansive kitchen where housekeeper Maria Delvato had found the alarming evidence. The smell, she reported, was faint but distinct, and a dark residue stained the sink and drain, immediately raising concerns. The forensic team arrived shortly after and began meticulously documenting the scene, using high-powered cameras to capture every angle of the kitchen. They swabbed the sink area and collected samples from the drain. While the rest of the kitchen appeared immaculate, the drain itself looked unusually clean, suggesting that something had recently been washed away. These findings, combined with the unusual cleanliness, prompted detectives to suspect an attempt at a cover-up. Detective Prude, diligently taking notes, noted how the home's air of wealth contrasted sharply with the troubling scene inside. As they spoke with neighbors, they learned that Pat Braun, though somewhat reclusive, was recognized for her vibrant personality and eccentric lifestyle. In the days leading up to the investigation, several neighbors had heard raised voices coming from the home, particularly heated arguments between Pat and Braxton. Forensic investigators employed a drain scope to look deeper into the pipes, searching for any evidence that might have been left behind. What they discovered confirmed their worst fears. Small bone fragments and traces of tissue were found and later matched to Braxton's DNA. Although the disposal had reduced much of the evidence, enough remained to establish the grim reality: Braxton's remains had been processed and flushed through the kitchen's garbage disposal. This disturbing method led detectives to contemplate the depth of Pat Braun's desperation or rage. With this chilling discovery, detectives Ellison and Prude set out to construct a timeline and identify a motive, recognizing they were facing a carefully planned act. As the investigation deepened, they pondered what could have driven someone to commit such a horrific act in a mansion that now concealed more secrets than opulence. The first person police chose to interview was Pat Braun herself. At 75, Pat, formerly Patrick, was an eccentric presence in the Henderson community, a wealthy individual who had transitioned to living as a woman later in life. Known for her bold personality, she garnered both admiration and resentment from her neighbors. However, following Braxton Townsend's disappearance, her usual confidence appeared to falter. The police observed that Pat, usually seen in designer clothing and known for hosting lavish dinners for her close friends, now appeared oddly subdued. In early March 2019, detectives Mark Ellison and Tajana Prude brought Pat into the Henderson Police Department for a formal interview. Seated in a small, sterile interrogation room, Pat looked visibly agitated. As the detectives began their questioning, Pat maintained that she had no involvement in Braxton's death. She asserted that her relationship with him was misunderstood, explaining that she intended to rescue him from his small-town life in Searchlight, Nevada, offering a luxurious lifestyle in return for his companionship and sexual favors. Pat described how they met at an upscale event in Las Vegas, claiming that Braxton was captivated by her tales of wealth and adventure. Within a month, they were engaged, and she generously spent on their wedding, gifting him a gold Rolex, expensive suits, and other items to help him feel at home in his new life. However, she acknowledged that their relationship had recently become strained. Friends of the couple confirmed that their seemingly glamorous marriage was marked by frequent arguments. Neighbors reported hearing loud confrontations coming from the mansion, with some even involving threats. As the detectives pressed her for more details, Pat's frustration began to escalate. Pat expressed to the detectives that she felt used by Braxton, claiming he was only after her money. She believed he intended to leave her, potentially taking some of her wealth with him, which infuriated her. Pat also hinted at suspicions regarding Braxton's fidelity, suggesting he might have been in contact with her former financial advisor, Robert "Bobby" McKelson, with whom she had a long and complicated history. The detectives observed a shift in Pat's demeanor from defensive to cold as they probed further. When they directly asked her if she had harmed Braxton, she scoffed, insisting on her innocence while avoiding eye contact. She implied that if Braxton had crossed any boundaries, he would have to face the consequences of betraying her. It was a vague statement, yet it hinted to the detectives that Pat had a strong sense of ownership over Braxton, which could have driven her to extreme actions. As the interview concluded, Detective Prude noted in her report that Pat's responses were revealing. While they weren't a confession, her words carried an unsettling truth about her feelings toward her young husband. With growing suspicion, the police knew they needed to investigate Pat further to uncover the truth behind Braxton's disappearance. The next person of interest was Robert Bobby Michelson, 45, Pat Braun's former financial advisor and longtime ex-lover. With a personal and professional history that spanned decades, Bobby had been closely tied to Pat for years. They had met when Bobby was just 20, starting what he described as a long love affair that evolved over the years, first as Pat's, then Patrick's lover, and later as her financial advisor. He helped her manage her wealth, working diligently to grow her assets as she aged. However, after Pat married Braxton, Bobby was abruptly fired from his position. Rumors circulated that Pat suspected Bobby of mismanaging her money, though he was never charged with any wrongdoing. By early March 2019, detectives Mark Ellison and Tajana Prude had compiled enough evidence to bring Bobby in for questioning. He arrived at the Henderson Police Department looking tense yet composed, dressed sharply in a Hugo Boss suit, as if to reinforce his image as the professional he once was. Bobby portrayed Braxton as a gold digger who had exploited Pat's wealth and vulnerability. He claimed he had tried to warn Pat that Braxton was only after her money, but she refused to listen. As he spoke, his frustration became apparent, despite his efforts to keep his emotions in check. When asked about his contact with Braxton, Bobby hesitated before admitting that they had encountered each other more than once. He claimed that Braxton had approached him for advice, expressing his unhappiness and desire to find a way out of the marriage. While Bobby didn't provide details, he hinted that he had discouraged Braxton from leaving Pat. Detectives observed that Bobby's tone became increasingly defensive as the interview progressed. When asked about Braxton's disappearance, he raised his hands in protest, insisting he had no involvement. However, as the questioning intensified, his responses grew more abrupt and terse. Bobby insisted he wasn't a violent person and urged the detectives to focus on other suspects instead of wasting time on him. As the interview concluded, the detectives gained a clearer understanding of Bobby's potential motives. He felt scorned and sidelined after Pat's new marriage, and his career as her advisor was effectively finished. Bobby felt he had been loyal to Pat, only to be discarded for a younger partner. Detective Pruitt noted that Bobby harbored a grudge that could, in some cases, lead to drastic actions, especially considering his long-standing loyalty to Pat. As Bobby left the station visibly angry, insisting on his innocence, his responses left detectives questioning whether his resentment toward Braxton could have pushed him to violence, or if he was merely a bitter ex-advisor entangled in a complex web of motives and shifting loyalties. In mid-March 2019, just as detectives struggled to find conclusive evidence, a shocking twist emerged. The weather was typical for Henderson, Nevada, dry and warm, with only a few wispy clouds drifting over the gated community where Braxton Townsend's story had taken a tragic turn. Investigators returned to the mansion one final time, hoping to uncover anything they might have overlooked. While conducting a routine sweep of the bathroom, Detective Tajana Prude spotted something unusual beneath a loose floor tile near the vanity. It was a small, leather-bound notebook wedged in a way that indicated it had been hidden in a hurry. As Detective Prude flipped through the pages, she discovered it was Braxton's private journal. The entries provided a rare insight into his life with Pat Braun, revealing the young man's growing disillusionment with his new marriage. One of the last entries was particularly revealing. Braxton wrote about a plan to escape, stating his intention to leave Pat and take a substantial sum of money with him. He mentioned that he had already confided this plan to someone he believed he could trust, Bobby Michelson, Pat's ex-advisor and former lover. Recognizing the journal's significance, Detective Mark Ellison summoned forensics to examine the pages for fingerprints or any additional clues. With Braxton's intention to leave confirmed in his own handwriting, the detectives had a clearer motive and a stronger basis to question Bobby. The journal was the missing piece, indicating that Braxton viewed Pat's wealth as a pathway to the life he desired, but at a personal cost he hadn't anticipated. Detectives were taken aback by this revelation. They realized Bobby had likely known about Braxton's intentions to take money from Pat, but the crucial question remained: had Bobby informed Pat of Braxton's plans? If he had, this information could have been the catalyst that pushed Pat over the edge. As detectives pressed on with their investigation, they considered that Bobby's awareness of Braxton's plan might have been shared with Pat out of spite, potentially making him a key player in a deadly chain of events. With Braxton's journal in hand, the police intensified their scrutiny of both Bobby and Pat, now more convinced than ever that this love triangle had resulted in darker consequences than anyone had anticipated. By late March 2019, detectives shifted their focus to a new suspect, Deborah Horsley Braun, Pat's estranged daughter. At 50, Deborah had led a quieter life compared to her mother, who had garnered attention for her extravagant spending and for transitioning to a woman in her 70s. Deborah had long harbored resentment toward Pat's transition and the younger partners Pat frequently brought into their family dynamic. Living in nearby Summerlin, Nevada, Deborah was known for her straightforward and blunt personality. Friends described Deborah as intense and fiercely protective of her family's legacy, unafraid to express her opinions. Conflicts with Braxton had begun early on at Pat and Braxton's wedding. Deborah made her disapproval clear, viewing Braxton as someone who was only interested in her mother's fortune. During her interrogation with detectives Tajana Prude and Mark Ellison, Deborah was asked about her last interactions with Braxton. She openly stated that she found the marriage to be a joke and had warned Pat that marrying someone so much younger was a mistake. Despite her strong disapproval, Deborah insisted she had no involvement in Braxton's death, claiming her warnings were solely out of concern for her mother's well-being. Throughout the questioning, Deborah maintained her composure but appeared visibly annoyed. When pressed about her relationship with Braxton, she eventually admitted that they had argued a few weeks before his disappearance. She recounted how Braxton flaunted his new lifestyle, boasting about plans to travel to places like Paris and New York, and even expressed a desire to secure some of Pat's assets for himself. Deborah expressed frustration with Braxton's attitude, asserting that it was obvious he was using Pat. The detectives noted her resentment, but Deborah insisted she had let her mother handle the situation, stating, "It's not my place to interfere." Detectives were especially curious about how Deborah seemed to have specific knowledge regarding Braxton's intentions to access Pat's money. Deborah acknowledged that her mother had confided in her about concerns regarding Braxton's behavior. However, she insisted she hadn't done anything beyond advising Pat to reconsider the marriage. Despite her calm demeanor, detectives sensed an underlying tension. When confronted with the evidence, Dina barely reacted, showing neither surprise nor remorse. Kayla's friends and family were devastated by the arrest, struggling to comprehend the horrific truth that her mother had been responsible for her tragic death. By March of 2018, the trial of Dinah Carlson for the murder of her daughter Kayla captivated the community of Roseville. The prosecution, led by Assistant District Attorney Marissa Griggs, a 38-year-old known for her no-nonsense demeanor, argued that Dinah had killed her daughter due to a toxic combination of jealousy, rage, and desperation. Griggs presented evidence of Dina's violent outburst after discovering Kayla's relationship with David Carlson and her plan to leave home. The prosecution painted a picture of a woman driven to madness by feelings of abandonment and betrayal, lashing out in the most brutal way possible. It hinted that he had confided in Bobby Michelson, Pat's former financial advisor, who appeared willing to betray Pat by revealing Braxton's intentions to her. This revelation likely triggered an uncontrollable rage in Pat, pushing her to a breaking point. In the days before the murder, Pat became increasingly bitter and betrayed. She had treated Braxton to lavish gifts, taken him to fancy events, and introduced him to her affluent lifestyle in Seven Hills, Henderson, Nevada. The idea that he might leave her and take some of her money was more than she could bear. Friends later noticed that Pat was acting strangely, trying to control Braxton's every move and calling him often throughout the day. One night in early March, after reading his recent journal entries, she hit her breaking point. Consumed by anger, she confronted him in the kitchen of the mansion. After the act, Pat experienced a grim sense of relief. She convinced herself that she had defended her dignity and wealth from Braxton's betrayal. In her mind, she had stopped him from exploiting her any longer. She carefully cleaned the kitchen, getting rid of any trace of Braxton's remains. However, detectives weren't deceived by the absence of a body. By examining the debris found in the disposal and linking the journal entries to Pat's increasingly obsessive behavior, they began to connect the dots. Surveillance footage from nearby stores captured Pat buying cleaning supplies and heavy-duty garbage bags just days before Braxton vanished. For detectives Tashiana Pruitt and Mark Ellison, this evidence was undeniable. On March 29th, police arrived at Pat's mansion to make the arrest. When Pat answered the door with a composed smile, her expression quickly changed to one of shock as the officers placed her in handcuffs. At first she remained silent, but as they escorted her to the police car, her calm facade crumbled. Witnesses noted that she seemed stunned, almost unable to comprehend that her meticulous plan had unraveled. Braxton's family, heartbroken yet relieved, thanked the police for delivering justice. They held a small memorial to honor Braxton, grieving for the dreams stolen by the woman who had promised him a life of luxury. Meanwhile, Pat faced the consequences of her actions, finding herself a former socialite now awaiting trial as a criminal. At her trial in late January 2020, Pat Braun's defense team employed a controversial strategy known as the transgender defense. Her lawyer, Alexander Grant, 56, a prominent defense attorney known for his unconventional tactics, argued that Pat's recent transition had caused her severe psychological distress, amplifying feelings of rejection and betrayal. He claimed that her decision to kill Braxton was not premeditated, but rather an impulsive response stemming from her heightened vulnerability as a transgender woman facing abandonment. This defense, while controversial, resonated with some members of the jury. The prosecution, led by State Attorney Liam Michaelsbung, 52, contended that Pat had meticulously planned the murder. He highlighted her documented history of possessive control over Braxton and the calculated way she disposed of his remains. Known for his direct and assertive style, Michaelsbung presented evidence of Pat's erratic behavior in the days before Braxton's death, using surveillance footage and entries from his journal to illustrate her obsessive need to dominate him. Michaels urged the jury to focus on Braxton's life and the brutal act that cut it short, dismissing Pat's defense as a way to avoid full responsibility. Despite his strong arguments, some jurors felt sympathy for Pat, resulting in a lesser charge. On January 30th, the jury convicted her of manslaughter instead of first-degree murder. Pat was sentenced to 15 years in prison, with the possibility of parole after 8 years. When the verdict was announced, she looked relieved but visibly shaken. She showed no remorse, insisting that her actions were a result of feeling manipulated and abandoned, a point her lawyer had stressed throughout the trial. The reduced sentence left Braxton's family devastated, feeling that true justice had not been served. His mother, Andrea Townsend, labeled the outcome a travesty, claiming the court had devalued her son's life. Friends and community members echoed her sentiments, bewildered that such a brutal crime could lead to a lesser sentence. As Pat was escorted out of the courtroom, her expression remained impassive. Those close to her claimed she felt vindicated, believing the lighter sentence validated her perception that Braxton had wronged her. For many, the trial left a lingering sense of injustice, marking a bittersweet end to a tragic story that had shocked Henderson and beyond. After Pat Braun's trial concluded, her life took a dramatic turn. Sentenced to 15 years in prison for manslaughter, she was transferred to the Florence McClure Women's Correctional Center in Las Vegas. This high-security facility housed numerous female inmates, including those convicted of serious offenses. Pat had to adapt to life in prison, trading her lavish lifestyle for a strict routine with limited freedom. Friends and family reported that she struggled with the loss of her former life, feeling both abandoned and vindicated by the jury's verdict. Meanwhile, Robert Bobby Michelson, Pat's former financial advisor, faced his own difficulties. After the trial, his business suffered from the negative publicity surrounding the case. He lost his job with Pat, and the fallout left him in a precarious financial situation. Resentful of how Pat had treated him during their relationship, Bobby was left with a bitter aftertaste. As the months went by, Bobby found some comfort in his personal life. Unexpectedly, Deborah Braun, Pat's estranged daughter, reached out to him. The two forged an unlikely bond, united by their shared resentment toward Pat and the chaos she had brought into their lives. Eventually, Bobby and Deborah fell in love and decided to marry in early 2023, despite their complicated pasts. Deborah, who had once harbored intense anger toward her mother, experienced a mix of relief and sadness following Pat's conviction. She divorced her husband shortly after the trial and focused on building a new life with Bobby. Together, they settled into a modest apartment in Henderson, seeking to distance themselves from the past. While some friends and family disapproved of their relationship, Deborah maintained that she had found happiness with Bobby, viewing him as a means to escape her turbulent upbringing. Meanwhile, Pat kept a low profile in prison, reportedly spending her days reflecting on her life choices. In conversations with other inmates, she expressed feelings of isolation, insisting that she never intended for her life to take such a turn. Reports indicated that Pat spent her time participating in prison programs aimed at helping other women, hoping to turn her life around for her eventual release. The stories of Pat, Bobby, and Deborah underscored the lasting impact of the tragic events, as each person navigated the consequences of their choices in their own way.